He was still alive when the blade entered. Bound to a wooden frame, his wrists pulled taut with rope, his mouth forced open by instinctive screams that echoed like hymns in a church desecrated by fire. His abdomen was opened with method, not haste. Skin split, fat parted, muscle torn. The executioner's hands reached inside not to kill but to extract. First came the intestines, steaming in the morning air. They did not rupture. They were pulled, hand over hand, and laid on the ground like rope unwound from a sovereign's body. The man who once wore a crown now wept as each organ was displayed like evidence. His genitals were sliced off next, thrown into the flames. He watched his body consumed, piece by sacred piece, before he himself was allowed to die. The sentence was legal, the ritual ancient. This was not vengeance by mob, it was policy, performed before hundreds, perhaps thousands. A king unmade not only by blade, but by the silence of the institutions that once knelt before him. This did not happen in the shadows, it happened in public. A monarch, condemned as a traitor, was not simply executed, he was disassembled, anatomically, politically, ceremonially. The horror was the point. Kings were supposed to be untouchable, their flesh anointed by oil, their rule sanctified by God. But this king was shown to bleed, to flinch, to beg, to be gutted like any man. His authority was not revoked by decree. It was peeled off his body, inch by inch, until there was nothing left to obey. And the people were made to watch, not to understand, but to absorb. They were taught that treason would not only kill the man who committed it, it would desecrate him, unmake his image, strip him of ritual, of burial, of humanity. What stood on that scaffold was not a criminal, it was a lesson, a demonstration that no man, not even a crowned one, stood above the law when the law felt threatened. But this law was not neutral, it was trembling, because only a system afraid of collapse performs cruelty with such theatrical precision. The body was not destroyed in anger, it was destroyed to reassert control. The knife did not just enter flesh, it re-entered the body politic, carving boundaries in blood. What is sovereignty, after all, when it is forced to prove itself through entrails? What is monarchy, when the crown can be removed and the head that wore it severed, burned, and scattered? This was more than an execution, it was a ritual of erasure. The man's legacy was meant to dissolve with his body, and yet the very act of public torture ensured that he would never be forgotten. Because once you watch a king scream as his body is emptied in front of you, you never look at a throne the same way again. He was not born to die like that. He was born into ceremony, swaddled in velvet, kissed by bishops, named in golden ink. He was a son of the crown, a child carved into destiny by clerics and bloodlines. But beneath the surface of this royal beginning lay the fault lines that would one day split his body in public. For kings are not just born, they are made, and sometimes they are made badly. If the man was Edward II, and history strongly suggests it was, his tragedy began not in failure, but in inheritance. He was the only surviving son of Edward I, a king of terrifying will and relentless conquest. His father towered over English memory as a figure of iron, disciplining barons, breaking Wales, nearly consuming Scotland. Edward II, by contrast, was soft in both manner and temperament. Where his father wielded the sword, the son preferred the harp. Where his father enforced order, the son sought companionship. He was not uninterested in rule, but he was unarmored against it. His court became a mirror of his desires, not a fortress of his authority. That was his first mistake. He gave his affection freely and fatally to men who were not built to carry it. First, Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of minor standing, whose charm and insolence earned him not just the king's love, but the scorn of every noble who had learned to bow before power, not smile at it. Gaveston was elevated rapidly, made Earl of Cornwall, granted riches, and given a place at Edward's side that many believed indecent. Whether the relationship was romantic is debated, but it was certainly political, and in medieval monarchy the two were rarely separated. Nobles rebelled and Gaveston was exiled, then recalled, then executed, his body left desecrated on a hillside. Edward never forgot, but he did not learn. He replaced Gaveston with others, the Despensers, father and son, men even more ruthless, more polarizing. Hugh Despenser the Younger became the king's new shadow. Where Gaveston had been flippant, Hugh was methodical. He siphoned wealth, confiscated land, and used Edward's affection as a weapon against the barons. Enemies of the crown were not merely punished, they were bankrupted, their estates transferred to Hugh, their names dragged through legal dust. The English court, once fractious but functional, calcified into resentment. Even Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, withdrew. She had married him in youth, endured his favoring of others, and raised their children under the cloud of humiliation. When the king sent their son to France on a diplomatic mission, she went with him and did not return. Instead, she forged an alliance. With Roger Mortimer, a former noble turned rebel, she plotted what no queen was meant to consider, the overthrow of her king. She returned to England not with flowers, but with troops. The nobles, tired of Despenser, tired of confiscation, tired of Edward's obliviousness, welcomed her. Cities opened their gates. The king fled. Hugh Despenser fled with him. They were captured, quickly, without honor, without a final stand, not in the echo of battle, but in the cold grasp of betrayal. Despenser was tortured first, dragged, hanged, disemboweled alive, castrated, and then quartered. His screams echoed through Hereford, but for Edward the fate would be slower, more ceremonial. For the problem was not just that he had ruled poorly, it was that he had failed to maintain the illusion that kingship was sacred. He had confused affection with authority. He had allowed his private bonds to dictate public policy. And the people, those who still believed that monarchy was divine, could not forgive the sacrilege of weakness. A council convened, a deposition arranged. It was not difficult. Edward's son was declared king. Edward III, only 14. The father was forced to abdicate, his seal taken, his words recorded in shame. He was no longer Edward, by the grace of God, King of England. He was just Edward of Caernarfon, a deposed monarch, and soon a prisoner, but not a quiet one. His existence was a threat. So long as he breathed, his name could be used. So long as he lived, rebellion had a figurehead. And so the next phase began, not of execution, but of transformation. A king would become a thing. A man who once ruled empires would be reduced, not in a single blow, but in slow, sanctioned disappearance. That is the cruelest truth about monarchy. When it fails, it does not merely collapse, it is digested. And Edward was next. Edward of Caernarfon, once King of England, no longer had a throne, a court, or even a name that commanded fear. What he had was a cell and the lingering stench of ceremonial failure. Imprisoned first at Kenilworth Castle, then transferred to Berkeley Castle under the watch of men loyal to Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, Edward was not executed in haste. His captors understood that monarchs cannot simply vanish. They must be unmade carefully, slowly. His presence, though physically confined, remained politically radioactive, and so began a campaign of deliberate erasure, psychological, symbolic, anatomical. The walls of Berkeley Castle did not echo with overt violence at first. Rather, they whispered with humiliation. Edward was kept in squalor. Filth was his bedding. Rats replaced advisors. Food, when it came, arrived cold, sometimes spoiled, always meant to weaken. But it was not poisoning they chose. That would have been too clean, too silent. His captors wanted not only to remove him, but to invert him, to take the man once robed in ermine and wrap him in rot, to reduce his body not to a corpse, but to a contradiction, a king in rags, a sovereign sleeping in straw soaked with urine. The humiliation was architectural. His chambers were windowless, damp and infested. His guards rotated often. Some were instructed to mock him, others to ignore him entirely. No trial, no words, just degradation by inches. Because his crime had not been written in law books, it had been written into the social fabric. He had become unkinged, not by rebellion, but by disgust. And disgust is more corrosive than swords. But it would not end with confinement. The whispers in court began to grow louder, that Edward might escape, that loyalists in Wales stirred, that his continued existence was an invitation to civil rupture. Isabella and Mortimer, despite their grip on the young Edward III, knew the former king had to be removed. But how? The execution of a monarch, even a deposed one, required more than stealth. It required performance, it required finality, and it required a method so violent, so unspeakably vivid, that no part of the man could be rehabilitated in memory. And so it happened. In the dead of night, on the stone floor of Berkeley Castle, he was restrained not with iron, but with ritual. According to some chroniclers, they inserted a horn or funnel into his rectum to prevent visible burns and forced a red-hot poker into his bowels. The aim was anatomical horror without external mutilation. But other accounts, darker, older, claim a different end, that his body was held down, his garments cut away, and his abdomen sliced open in front of a select few. That no royal physician stood by, only executioners who worked with calm precision. That his intestines were pulled out slowly, the tissue still alive, still responding, still trying to retract. And that he screamed. A high, broken sound that did not resemble command or authority or even language. Just the cry of a man whose body no longer belonged to him. Whether it was a poker or a knife, the outcome was the same. Edward II, once God's anointed king, died not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but flayed by power that once served him. The horror was not in the method, it was in the message. That kingship is not immunity, that crowns do not protect flesh, and that when the state feels threatened by its own reflection, it will kill the mirror. The silence that followed was absolute. No official cause of death was given. The body was shown in guarded condition. The funeral was carried out with formality, but the air around it was hollow. Edward III, just a boy, now wore the crown, but he too understood. He had not inherited his father's power. He had inherited the ghost of his father's undoing. And the people learned, not just that a king had died, but that a king had been dismantled. There are deaths that end a life, and there are deaths that dismantle an identity. Edward II's was not the former. It was the latter. What happened on the stone floor of Berkeley Castle was not simply the conclusion of a failed reign. It was a deliberate unmaking of everything the crown was supposed to sanctify. This was not regicide in the classic sense. It was anatomical negation, a reversal of sacral kingship. Every incision told a story the court dared not speak aloud, that this king had failed so completely, so visibly, that his very organs had to be removed in silence, in secret, to restore the myth of monarchy. The act itself, whether carried out with the red-hot poker of rumour or the surgeon's knife of quieter sources, was done in darkness, both literal and moral. If the poker legend is to be believed, the instrument was chosen precisely because it would leave no external wound, no blood on the sheets, no bruises for the coroners, just internal devastation, a sovereign cooked from the inside, his screams smothered by stone walls and muffled attendants. If the alternative account is true, of disembowelment, of entrails pulled slowly through a deep incision in the abdomen, then it was not secrecy they sought. but meaning. Then his torment was witnessed, perhaps not by a crowd, but by those in power, those who needed to see what became of weakness. Either way, his agony was sanctioned. His cries, if they came, were consumed by the very structure meant to protect him. For what is a castle when it houses not a ruler, but a prisoner of his own blood? What are walls when the flesh within them is stripped of its final dignity? Edward's body, royal and human, became a battleground for competing messages, one of authority, one of betrayal, one of horror. His disembowelment was not an act of punishment, it was an act of purification. The monarchy could not bear to bury him whole. Something in him had to be destroyed completely so that the institution itself could recover. And in that moment, Edward ceased to be a person. He became an event, a memory shaped in absence, a warning without inscription. When the body was finally removed from the scene, it was guarded, not to protect it, but to control the story around it. Physicians were not summoned to confirm death. Chroniclers were not allowed to document what they saw. Instead, a thin layer of state ritual was laid over the carcass of personal annihilation. A funeral was held, a crown placed near his coffin, prayers said, but no one believed he had died cleanly. The whispers survived, not despite the secrecy, but because of it. And those whispers infected the generations. Because when a king dies in torment and the record is redacted, the imagination becomes the historian. Some said he was murdered with a spit of iron. Others said his screams could be heard from the ramparts for hours. Some even claimed he survived, escaped, and lived in exile, because the truth of his death was too grotesque to believe. But these theories miss the point. They seek to recover Edward the man, when what truly mattered was Edward the object, the body that the state once clothed in silk and then cut open like a traitor's. This was monarchy cannibalizing itself, a ritual not of succession, but of erasure. The king was not executed, he was unimagined. What survives of Edward II is not legacy, it is aftermath. Not a reign, but a rupture, recorded not in treaties or reforms, but in the silence that followed a scream no one was allowed to document. His story did not end with a grave, it ended in the denial of a body, in the whispered retellings of how a king could be taken apart, piece by piece, until nothing sovereign remained. His flesh did not become sacred relic, nor symbol of martyrdom. It became uncertainty. Pain diffused across generations, known only through contradiction. A monarch buried with honor, yet rumored to have died with fire in his gut. A crown passed to a son, yet stained by the knife that likely silenced the father. And still he is remembered, not because he ruled well, but because he died wrongly. That is the legacy of sovereign torture. It doesn't simply mark the fall of one man, it exposes the fault lines in the institution that created him. A state secure in its authority does not flay its monarch to prove a point. A regime confident in its power does not tear open the abdomen of its symbol. The spectacle of Edward's death was not a sign of strength, it was a confession. That monarchy, when fearful, will devour its own. That the divine right of kings was never about mercy but about control. And when control falters, cruelty rushes in to fill the void. What is left to believe in when kings can be gutted like criminals? What remains sacred when royal blood spills onto stone and the crown pretends not to see? Edward's body may have rotted in secret, but his death taught what his life could not, that even thrones sit on flesh, and that when power becomes desperate enough, it will tear out the very organs it once anointed, just to make the silence absolute. If you want to hear more of the stories they tried to bury, subscribe. We don't just remember, we reveal.